Hi everyone, welcome to another tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how I assembled my Biscornu, and I don't have it here to show you right now because most of you know that it was a gift for my mum, so she's enjoying it right now, but I do have this picture to show you. This is the one that is in the video that I completed, the Sweetheart Tree kit. You don't have to purchase a kit like this to do a Biscornu. There are plenty of free online designs that you can use, and you can use the instructions in the video to put those together. I go into a little bit of detail about that in the video, so I hope you enjoy it. As I said in the intro, your Biscornu doesn't have to be from an actual Biscornu kit like myself. You can actually create one using two square pieces of design that you have either stitched yourself, or there are plenty of free Biscornu patterns online. So I highly suggest looking into those. So you will need two square cross-stitch designs. They don't have to be the same like mine. That was the way it was in my kit. A lot of other ones actually have a very detailed design for the front and something quite basic for the rear. Completely up to you. But you do need to make sure that they are the exact same size. So you want your finished size area to be the same. The next step is to make sure you have a back stitched border around your design. Now, when I followed the instructions on my kit, it had the actual placement line for the back stitch. You can obviously create this yourself. You can decide how many stitches away from your design you wish to do this. I recommend using 2 strands of cotton, and if you use cotton in the same or as close as you can get colour to the actual fabric, then you won't actually be able to see this seam line at all once it's been stitched up, and you get a really nice neat appearance. Make sure you anchor your cotton securely when you begin, and if you don't have enough cotton to do the entire design in one lot, when you run out of cotton, make sure you anchor the ends off securely again before restarting again with the same process. I actually backstitched mine in 2 lots of cotton and made sure each was anchored off correctly, and it was fine. Because this backstitch line is actually going to be your seam that you are joining the 2 pieces together with. Also make sure that your back stitch area is exactly the same on both pieces. If you're out by 1 stitch, your Biscornu will not work. So I suggest making sure you count, or probably counting is the best way. Count the amount of stitches across, make sure it is a square. So for instance, 47 back stitches across each side, and then do the exact same for the other piece of material. Next, you'll want to give your pieces a nice iron. If you are using over-dyed or hand-dyed threads in your design at all, I suggest being extra cautious here, because sometimes the heat from the iron can make the colours bleed. So maybe giving them a bit of a test first on a scrap piece of cross-stitch material, just to make sure that the colours aren't going to run on you. And in case you didn't already know, you always iron your cross-stitch pieces on the back only. Never, ever, ever touch the front of your work with an iron, because it will just flatten your stitching, and you don't want that. Once you've done that, you can gather all your other assembly tools together. So I have 2 stitch pieces of my Biscornu design with the back stitch already completed. I have my beads, because I chose to add the beads around the edge of my design. You don't have to do this, but I just liked the finished effect. You will also need any filling, which, sorry, is not in the photo. I used just normal wadding, or you may call it fibre fill. I have heard some stitchers use crushed walnut shells. I wasn't certain on where to get those. I do believe that each time you stick your needle in the pincushion, that the walnut shells actually sharpen the needle, as well as that it gives it gives the Biscornu a little bit of weight. So obviously if you're just using wadding like me, the actual pincushion itself is really lightweight. So that's up to you. You'll also need 2 decorative beads or buttons to go in the center, and also your thread for attaching those. Next step is to trim your fabric down to size. If you look closely in the photo here, you can see my back stitching line, and we want to measure about 1/2 inch from that line, and that will be your seam allowance. So you do this by cutting on the grain of the fabric and equally measuring that 1/2 inch all the way around. So we're trimming all 4 edges on both the top and the bottom stitched pieces, and save those small pieces that you've cut off because we're going to be using them for something else. And this photo here shows my 1/2 inch seam allowance from that back stitch line to my cutting line. So this photo shows the front and back pieces. The piece at the bottom has had the seam allowances cut, and the top piece is about to be done. As in this photo, you can see they're both now cut to the right size. So using the scraps of material that you cut off the edges of your fabric, you need to cut 2 small pieces just slightly larger than your buttons. These pieces are going to be going on the inside of the Biscornu, underneath where the button is placed, just to protect the fabric a little more and give it a little bit more reinforcement. So you need to go ahead and cut them into a circle just slightly larger than the button size. So if you look very carefully, you can just see the outline of the circle as I've placed that over the very center point of my Biscornu, and that's on the inside of the actual Biscornu. So making a knot in your thread, hold the circle on the underside of the Biscornu and the button on the top, and bring your needle with the knot through from the bottom and then up through the button, and go up and down through this button several times to secure it in place. I went up and down through mine about 3 or 4 times. I've noticed that not all Biscornus are actually completed this way. A lot of them in the instructions, they tell you to assemble the entire Biscornu first and then you attach the button later. As this was my first Biscornu, I don't have anything to compare it to, but I actually did find it quite easy to attach the button this way and got the placement of it perfect. So I have no issues in doing it like this again. So then you repeat the process again for the other side of the Biscornu. So next step is to turn the trimmed edges under and finger press them towards the back of the fabric, right along where those back stitch lines are. And when you get to the corners, just press the corners out into a mitre. And again, you'll need to do this with both pieces. Now you need to find the centre point of both the top and bottom pieces of your Biscornu. Now to make the odd Biscornu shape, the irregular shape that it is, you need to find the centre point of the top piece along the top of your design, but on the bottom piece it differs because you need to find the corner, and I'll show it here in this diagram. And you can differentiate my top and bottom pieces by the colour of the pins. So the one with the blue pin I've designated as the top, and the one with the red pin I've designated as the bottom. In the Sweetheart Tree kit that I have, it tells you on the chart exactly where these points are. So if you don't have that information and you're making the Biscornu by yourself based on, say, a freebie online pattern, you can easily find these points. For the top point, you'll need to count across, count the number of back stitches and then find the middle. So, or count the number of holes and find the middle, and that's where you would place your pin. And then on the bottom piece, obviously you would place it in the corner, just like in my diagram. So next is the fun part, and also the slightly scary part, and that's putting it all together. So as in the diagram here, they use a whip stitch technique. I used the technique on the right hand side because I added beads to mine. So every other stitch a bead was added. As I said before, you don't have to add beads, you can just do the normal whip stitch. And as you can see, each stitch lines up. So you've got say that's the top on the left hand side, the top of the design, and on the right hand side is the bottom of the design. Each back stitch there is lined up next to each other as you stitch, and the needle passes through one and then the other. As long as you start in the right point and you don't miss any stitches when you're doing your whip stitch, your Biscornu will come together perfectly. The only way you can really make a mistake with this is if you have not back stitched the same number of strands on both the top and bottom pieces, or you have, where you've started, you haven't started in the equal point on both pieces, or when you're whip stitching, you've accidentally missed a stitch. So in those incidences, if any of those occur, then your Biscornu will not come together properly. But what I like about this is you get to realize pretty much whenever you get to the center of the design, you'll be at the corner. So when you get to the center front, you'll be at the corner bottom. And so you sort of know by then that, okay, I think I've gone off a little bit because that doesn't match. And that gives you that opportunity to fix it up. So you have to pull some stitches out. So hopefully that won't happen. So you'll need to thread your needle with floss, and it's up to you whether you use the same colour floss as what you used for the back stitching, which is also similar colour to the material, or whether you choose to use nylon thread. It's completely up to you. And the instructions weren't specific on how many strands to use, so I chose to use one because I was adding the beads and I didn't want the extra volume going through the bead. So make a nice strong knot at the end of your thread. So concentrating on the bottom piece first, and that's the piece where you pinned the corner of your center mark, come up through the bottom of the design so that your knot is anchored underneath the design and can't be seen. So we're going to make the first stitch by passing the needle and the thread under the first back stitch to the left of that corner where you came up through the bottom. So there's the very first stitch to the left of the corner. Now, when you put your needle through this stitch and through all the following stitches, you're not actually going to go through the fabric at all. You're just going to go through this back stitch. Now we've got that stitch in its first position. We're going to match it up with the same beginning position on the top Biscornu piece. And I'll insert the diagram here again so you can see B2 is what we have just done, and we're about to secure it with B1. So lining up the bottom piece, which is at the top of the photo, the top piece of fabric is the bottom of my Biscornu, and the top of my Biscornu is at the bottom of the photo. That makes sense. We're going to match those points. Now you can see the blue pin is still in place, marking the center of that design, which is actually the hole in between the stitches. Now, as we started with that first stitch, we started to the very left stitch of the beginning of the corner. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to start with the very first stitch on the left of where that pin is marked. So once you've located where that stitch is, from there you just pull your needle through that stitch and keep pulling until it's gone all the way through. Now the trickiest thing I found with this Biscornu was finding a comfortable way of holding it, and Biscornus all come in a variety of sizes, so obviously the smaller the Biscornu, the fiddlier it's going to be to hold it while you stitch. But eventually you should be able to find yourself a nice comfortable position. they recommended that pinching the top and the bottom of the fabric together was an easier way of doing it, and I actually did quite like doing it that way also. So in this photo I've completed my first stitch, and I'm about to go through the very next stitch at the top of the fabric using that whip stitch technique, and then adding my bead onto this stitch, because as I said at the beginning, when you're attaching beads you need to attach them to every other stitch. And to attach the bead you simply do one half of the stitch first, so one side of the fabric, add the bead onto the needle, and then do the other part of the stitch. Simple as that. And it's not easy taking progress shots of this type of stitching, but hopefully you can follow along. In this photo here you can see I've just finished a stitch with the bead, and the needle is already through the very next stitch, ready to be pulled through to be completed. So just to recap at this point, the trimmed edges that we trimmed around our back stitch are folded to the inside so they can't be seen while we do the whip stitch, and you work the whip stitch from the top and bottom pieces while pinching both pieces of fabric together with your thumb and forefinger so that the back stitches are lined up parallel to each other. Make sure when you're doing this that you keep your tension equal all the way through. You don't want to be pulling it too tight and distorting it, and don't pierce the fabric at all. We just want the stitch to go through the back stitch. Now I mentioned earlier about stitching this with my back stitch in the same colour as the fabric, and as you can see here it does hide that actual whip stitch so it can't be seen. If you wanted to do something more decorative, you could actually back stitch it in another colour, and therefore it would be noticeable if that's the type of look you were going for. So you continue along this way, matching each stitch, as I said, until you reach the corner, and the corners can be quite tricky. It's a matter of sort of folding the edges under. Take your time. That's the best advice I can give you, is really take your time. Make sure that you've got it lined up, because you really don't want to go wrong and have to unpick it. So just try and gently ease the corner under. Take the top stitch, ease the corner under a little bit more, and then try and follow the stitch through. And as you continue stitching this way, eventually you'll start to see a zigzag look to the Biscornu as the irregular shape starts taking shape. Now as I get to this photo, another thing I want to point out is to make sure to be especially careful when adding beads, that as you have added your bead to the stitch, as your needle goes through for the next stitch, that you don't get your cotton wrapped around the wrong side of the bead. And it actually happened to me a few times, so I know it is possible. So just again, take it slowly and be careful. And this photo is also probably the best photo to show you how they recommend holding your pieces as you stitch them. So pinching them between your thumb and forefinger. And for the most part, I did find this the easiest way as well. So the next few photos show some close-ups of the corners and with my beads attached, how it looks. I'm quite happy with how that all turned out. The instructions did mention that at the corner points that you can take an extra stitch through the same stitches just to reinforce those corners. I didn't actually feel the need to do that, but that's a worthwhile thing to mention, that if you want a little bit of extra reinforcing in the corners, feel free to just do that stitch, that particular corner stitch, twice. And here's another view. I found this another way of holding the fabric. Once you've gotten safely past the corner, you can sort of flatten out the fabric in this way and do the whip stitches. And again, I'm working from the top and I'm working downwards, and I'm actually approaching another corner there in that photo. So just keep working along this way, and it will take some time. It is a tedious process, but I found it really satisfying as well. It was really addictive, and so it did take a while, yes. It actually took me a few afternoons because I couldn't do it at night time. I needed to do it during the day, and I also needed my magnifying light to help me. So if you are struggling with seeing the stitches, and especially because those back stitches are the same color as the fabric, it adds another level of difficulty. So by all means use a magnifying light, and that will help you see the stitches more closely. So hopefully by now you've gotten to the last portion. So when there's all but one side left to be stitched, this is the time to now stuff it. So if you haven't already done so, I suggest using a chopstick or some other blunt tool just to poke out those corners from the inside. Make sure you're happy with how the whole thing is looking, and then you can stuff it with whatever you choose, whether it be wadding or crushed walnut shells, as I mentioned earlier, or they even suggested weighted plastic pellets. So if you want something a little heavier, you might want to look down that avenue. Otherwise, I was really happy with just using the wadding. So here's my photo of the stuffing of my Biscornu, and you need to make sure that you get right into those corners to fill it all out nicely. And then all that's left to do for this portion is to continue stitching up the rest of that join. Take a few extra whip stitches around the corner, and then place a knot at the end of your cotton and pull that through to hide the loose tail. Okay, so this is the last section, and this is where you bring those two buttons from the front and the back a little closer together, using either floss or invisible thread. I'll be completely honest and say that I liked this process the least, and it was probably because I was using the invisible thread. That stuff's not the easiest to work with, and although I was quite happy with the process of it, it was the ending it off and hiding it. I sort of got myself a little bit tangled up, and yeah, didn't like that part of it. So on my next Biscornu, when it comes to this step, I will actually be using cotton thread instead of the invisible thread. So the instructions said to thread the needle with 2 strands of invisible thread and to tie a double knot at the ends. Then you have to slide the knotted thread under the edge of the button, catching a bit of the fabric when you do it, and bring the needle up through the hole in the top button. And this is done so that obviously you hide the knot. So bring the thread up through the hole in the top button, and with your thumb and finger squeezing the Biscornu together. So you've got your thumb on the top button and your forefinger on the bottom button, squeezing it together as tight as you can. That will create that indentation in the middle of the Biscornu. So while you're holding that, you need to sew through the top button, through the filling, and then through the bottom button several times. And again, this is a bit tricky, trying to guide that needle through the exact hole you're trying to find. Again, also a little bit tricky using the invisible thread. Do it with firm tension. You'll need to do it several times so that the indentation remains. If you don't do it enough, or your tension isn't tight enough, your Biscornu will just bounce back to the shape it was before you started. And then you'll need to knot the thread behind the button at the bottom and then trim away any excess thread. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. It was a little trickier showing you how to whip stitch through photos, But if you have any questions and comments regarding this tutorial, please leave them below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And keep watching, I have many more tutorials planned for the future. Take care and happy stitching!